The instructor never breaks. That is what everyone tells me before I sign the paperwork. Halden Verland does not smile. Halden Verland does not soften. Halden Verland corrects your grip on the wheel with 2 fingers and does not apologize for the touch. I am 40 hours into the 6-week certification, and I have believed every word she said. Then, at 9 on a Thursday morning, on a stretch of empty rural road with clear visibility and no traffic behind us at all, I glance into the mirror. Her eyes are already there waiting. I smile. Small, involuntary, not calculated. Her foot slams the passenger brake. The car stops. There is nothing in the road. There is nothing behind us. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from, and subscribe. That was Thursday. Let me tell you how I got there. I am 27 years old, and I am at Verland Precision because my boss decided in April that she was tired of driving herself to depositions. Her name is Attorney Trentham, and she is one of the 4 senior partners at the firm where I have worked as executive assistant for the last 3 years. She is precise, unsparing, and unwilling to spend 45 minutes of prep time behind a steering wheel when she could be on the phone with opposing counsel instead. So, she bought a Mercedes, and she looked at me across her desk one Tuesday afternoon in April, and she said, "Mira, I need you to be able to drive that car for me. Legally, insurable, certified." I had a license. I had a clean record. What I did not have was the advanced defensive driving certification that our firm's specialty insurance required for anyone driving a partner's vehicle in a professional capacity. The certification cost $7,000. Attorney Trentham did not blink. She wrote the check that afternoon and she told me to enroll at Verland Precision because her old friend Judge Mara had told her that was the only academy in 3 states worth attending. I looked it up that night. Verland Precision was a small operation, 40 minutes outside the city, with a converted airfield for a closed track and a stripped bungalow for a classroom. 1 instructor's name on the website. 1 instructor's face in the single professional photograph, which was black and white and taken at what looked like a track event 15 years ago. She was standing next to a race car with her arms crossed and her hair pulled back, and she was not smiling. Her biography ran 4 paragraphs and did not use a single unnecessary word. SCCA endurance driver for 6 years. Private security driver for a Boston family for 8 years. Founder and lead instructor at Verland Precision for the last 7. The reviews were sparse and glowing. Every one of them used some version of the same word. Strict, demanding. She will not certify you if you are not ready. She does not care about your feelings, and she does not care about your timeline, and she does not care about how much you paid. I called on a Friday, and the woman who answered the phone was... I understood immediately. Halden Verland herself. Her voice was level and low, and had the specific quality of someone who was fully attentive to me while I spoke, and would not waste a syllable when it came time to respond. She asked me 4 questions. She quoted me the schedule. She told me the first classroom session was Monday at 7:30 in the morning, and that if I was more than 4 minutes late, I would be asked to reschedule for the next cohort in October. I was not late. The academy was set 2 miles down a rural road with fields on either side, past a battered sign that said Verland Precision in white letters on dark green paint. The gate was open. The gravel lot held 4 cars and a black training Mercedes with tinted windows and a small silver logo on the door. The bungalow was low and modest with a wooden porch and a wide window that looked out toward the airfield. Through the window I could see her already at the whiteboard, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a mug of coffee on the desk beside her. I sat in my car for 1 minute and did the thing I had learned to do before every meeting that mattered. I checked my hands. I checked my breathing. I checked whether I was armored well enough for what was coming. Then I got out and I walked into the bungalow. She looked up when I came in. Halden Verland was 41 years old. I knew this because it was in the paragraph about her career on the website. What the website did not tell me was that she had the kind of composed face that made you understand at first sight why her students used the word strict without needing to explain it further. Her hair was dark and pulled back at the nape. Her eyes were a pale, tired brown that missed nothing. She wore a black polo shirt with the small silver Verlin Precision logo on the chest, dark trousers, black boots that were not new but had been cared for. There was a watch on her right wrist. A steel-cased chronograph, with a black leather strap that had been worn until the leather had softened at the edges. Some people wear watches on the right wrist because they are left-handed. I would learn later that Halden was not. She said, "Mira Larson." I said, "Yes." She said, "Coffee is on the counter. Classroom starts in 6 minutes." That was the entire exchange. I made coffee. I sat in the second row of a room that had 5 chairs and one other student, a man in his 50s who nodded at me once and then went back to studying the printed materials on the folder in front of him. His name, I would learn during introductions, was Peter, and he was a corporate driver certifying for a new client. He was pleasant and quiet, and would complete the program in the same 6 weeks I did, and would move to the West Coast the day after the certification. Halden began at 7:30 exactly. She did not welcome us. She did not soften the opening. She said, "Over the next 6 weeks I am going to teach both of you how to drive. What you have been doing until now is operating a vehicle. It is a different thing." She wrote nothing on the whiteboard while she said this. Her hands were behind her back. Her eyes moved between the two of us with the assessing attention of someone who was not interested in what we thought we knew and was going to spend the next 6 weeks demonstrating why. She said, "The first assessment is at 8:15. You will drive the training Mercedes on the closed track. I will be in the passenger seat. I will tell you what to do. You will do it. If I ask you a question, you will answer it accurately, or you will say that you do not know. If you do not know something, that is information I need. If you pretend to know something you do not, that is a problem." She looked at me directly on the last sentence. I said, "Understood." She said, "Good." At 8:15 I was in the driver's seat of the training Mercedes. The car had a modified passenger side. There was a second brake pedal. There was a second steering wheel option that could be deployed but rarely was. There was a dashboard camera mounted to the windshield and a second camera at the rear window, and Halden had explained, without any inflection at all, that every session was recorded, that we would review the footage in the debrief, and that the footage was destroyed at the end of my certification cycle. She sat down in the passenger seat and closed her door and did not say anything for 6 full seconds. Then she said, "Adjust your seat and your mirrors, take your time." I adjusted my seat. I adjusted the rear view mirror. I adjusted the driver's side mirror and then the passenger side mirror. She watched me do all of this with the same attention she had watched me from behind the whiteboard. She said, "Show me your grip on the wheel." I put my hands on the wheel at 9 and 3. She said, 10 and 2. I moved my hands to 10 and 2. She said, "No. 10 and 2. But relaxed. Your knuckles are white." I loosened my grip. She said, "Better. Airbags deploy through the wheel. 9 and 3 saves your face. 10 and 2 lets you steer through a slide. You will use both, but you will default to 10 and 2 for the training work." I nodded. She said, "Do not nod when I give you information. Say that you understand." I said, "I understand." Something in her face did the smallest possible thing. Not a smile. Not an approval. Just the barely visible acknowledgement that I had learned a rule and applied it inside the same minute I had heard it. Then it was gone, and she was pointing at the ignition. She said, "Start the car, follow the cones, first lap at 15, then 20, then 30. I will tell you when to change." I drove the first lap at 15. She said one thing during the lap. "Your line into 3 is wide. Cut it closer next time." I cut it closer on the second lap. She said, "Good." That single word, on the second lap, done in her flat, unweighted voice with her eyes on the track and her hand resting easily on the console between us, was the most encouraging thing anyone had said to me at work in 6 months. I did not understand then what it meant that I noticed the compliment that specifically. I noticed it because it was the first crack in her surface, and I had already, in 90 minutes, become the kind of person who was looking for cracks. We drove for 2 hours that first morning. She corrected my line 4 times. She corrected my braking twice. She never raised her voice. She never touched the controls on her side. When we finished, she gestured me back to the classroom, and we spent 30 minutes reviewing the dashcam footage. She would pause the video at specific frames and point at the screen with the tip of a pen and explain what my hands had done and what they should have done. She was, in this mode, patient in a way that had nothing to do with warmth. It was the patience of a person who cared, absolutely, about the process of making me better, and had zero interest in making me feel any particular way about the process. I liked it. I liked it so completely and so immediately that I sat in my car in the gravel lot for 6 minutes after the day ended, and I did not put the key in the ignition, and I looked at the low bungalow through the windshield, and I thought about the fact that I had just met a person who was going to be very important to my life for 6 weeks, and that when the 6 weeks were over, she was going to sign a piece of paper and I was going to drive away from Verland Precision and probably never see her again, and I did not, that first afternoon, know how to think about that. I put the key in the ignition. I drove home. I did not tell my roommate about my day because there was nothing to say that would not sound wrong. The second week established the rhythm. Classroom in the morning, closed track in the mid-morning, urban route work in the afternoon on a specific loop through the rural town nearest the academy. Halden was, in every context, exactly as she had been on Monday. She corrected. She observed. She named the specific thing I had done wrong and the specific thing I should do instead, and she did not editorialize. In the classroom, she showed footage of security drivers she had known personally and analyzed their line choices in the specific scenarios that had ended their careers or saved their principals. She would say, "This driver was moved off detail after this incident. This driver was retained. Here is the difference. It was not about talent," she said once, quietly. It was about the 18 inches of judgment that separated one line from the other. I began to catalog her. I did not mean to. I had, in 27 years of paying attention to my life, developed a fairly good sense of when I was noticing something for professional reasons, and when I was noticing something for the other kind of reason. And by the end of the second week I was noticing Halden Verland for the other kind of reason more often than was fair to either of us. She wore the same style of black polo every day. She drank her coffee black in the mug with the chip. She did not check her phone during instruction. Her voice never rose. Her jaw flexed twice in the first 2 weeks. Once, when Peter braked hard for a rabbit that was not actually in the road, and once, more briefly, on Wednesday of the second week, when I made a mistake on my third lap on the wet skid pad and corrected it with a small sound of frustration. I saw her jaw flex the second time in the reflection of the windshield. She had not turned her head. She had not said anything. Her mouth had done nothing, and her eyes had done nothing, and her jaw had done the smallest possible tightening at the corner near the ear. I understood, watching that flex in the reflection, that I had upset her, not by making the mistake, by the sound I had made about the mistake. She wanted me to be harder on my errors internally, and less demonstrative about them externally, and she had not said any of that yet, and she was going to say it in the debrief, and she had not been happy that I had made her have a feeling about it. She said it in the debrief. She said it exactly the way I had predicted she would. I said, "I understand." She said, "Good." I drove home that Wednesday, and I thought about the flex in the windshield reflection for the whole 40 minutes of the drive. I thought about what it meant that I had learned to read her in 2 weeks. I thought about what it meant that she had made me understand a rule about internal versus external response before she had said the rule out loud. I thought about the fact that I had never in my life been trained by someone whose attention I wanted this much, and whose approval mattered to me in a way I could not yet name. By the beginning of the third week, the physical proximity had become a thing I was managing rather than experiencing. Advanced driving instruction is not a discipline that allows for polite distance. Halden reached across me to adjust the rearview mirror when I said it wrong. She leaned over my shoulder from the passenger seat to point at a specific curve on the topographic map she kept in the door pocket. She put her hand on the back of mine, briefly, to correct my grip when I had drifted from 10 and 2 on the highway. Every one of these touches was clinical, brief, professional. Every one of these touches lasted long enough for me to feel the calluses on her palm and the warmth of her hand and the exact way she released the contact without any lingering, which was, in its own way, a kind of lingering. She smelled like coffee and clean cotton, and something warmer that I could not identify for the first 2 weeks. In the third week, I placed it. It was cedar. Cedar and a very faint suggestion of citrus that I only registered when she was very close, and even then only in the seconds after she had moved away. I did not smile at her. I had, over 3 weeks, developed the discipline of not smiling. It was not a rule she had stated. It was a rule I had inferred, because Halden did not smile back, and I did not want to be the student who was smiling into the flat professional wall of her attention and getting nothing in return. So I stopped smiling. I nodded. I said, "I understand." I answered her questions accurately. I did not ask her personal questions. I did not laugh at any of the very dry, small observations she made about traffic patterns or the driving habits of the drivers in the rural town who did not use turn signals. I received her instruction with a competence that matched her delivery, and I became, over 3 weeks, the kind of student she seemed to have designed the academy to produce. She was not unaware of this. On the Friday of the third week, after a 2-hour highway drill on the interstate that I had performed cleanly, she stood beside the driver's side door in the gravel lot and looked at me across the roof of the training. Mercedes for 1 measured second. She said, "You have adjusted quickly." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Do not thank me for accuracy. It is what I expect, only correct." I said, "Understood." Her eyes stayed on me for another second. Then she nodded once and walked into the bungalow. I sat in my car for the drive home, and I thought about the fact that Halden Verland had, in that exchange, given me the closest thing to praise she had given anyone in 3 weeks, and had immediately corrected herself for giving it. She had told me my accuracy was expected. She had told me not to thank her. She had, in the way she had structured the exchange, expressed exactly 2 things at once: that she had noticed me being good, that she did not want me to notice her noticing. The following Monday, it rained. Not a storm. The specific persistent gray drizzle that made the wet skid pad the correct place to be for the morning's work. Halden met me at the door of the bungalow at 7:30 and she said, "We are on the pad today. Warm gear. I have a spare jacket in the office if you did not bring one." I had not brought one. I had checked the forecast and had not, in the specific new distraction that was the whole of my week, thought carefully about how I was dressed for the day. She said, "Come in." She went to a locker at the back of the office. She pulled out a black shell jacket with the Verlin Precision logo at the chest. She handed it to me across the desk. I put it on. It was too large in the shoulders, and it smelled of cedar and clean cotton and coffee. It smelled of her. I understood, buttoning it at the collar, that I was going to wear her jacket for 4 hours in the rain, and that the smell was going to be on my hair and in my clothes when I drove home that evening, and that neither of us was going to say a word about any of it. She said, "Let us go." The wet skid pad was a large circular section of asphalt at the far end of the converted airfield, marked in yellow cones, watered constantly by an overhead sprinkler system that Halden turned on from a control box at the perimeter. The idea was to simulate the loss of traction that happened on a wet road at speed. The idea was to teach me to feel the moment the rear of the car began to rotate before the rotation became a spin, and to correct through it with the wheel and the throttle rather than the brake. I got in the driver's seat of the older Crown Vic she used for pad work. She got in the passenger seat. She was wearing her own black shell, and her hair was still pulled back at the nape, and her face was, in the gray morning light, coming through the windshield, more distinct than it usually was. The rain gave the interior a specific closeness. There was no smell of coffee. They had caged shoes. Diding tu en. There was only the smell of the wet asphalt outside, and my jacket, which was her jacket, and the very faint suggestion of cedar and citrus that I had catalogued in the third week and had learned, since, to recognize inside of a second. She said, "Take it to 30. Turn in on my call. Do not brake. Let the rear come out. When you feel the yaw begin, correct into it with the wheel and give me half throttle. If you correct with brake, I will take the pad from you and we will do it again." I said, "Understood." I took it to 30. She called the turn-in. The rear of the Crown Vic came out on cue. My hands did what she had trained them to do, and the car came back around and I brought it to a controlled straight line at the exit cones. She gestured me back to the start. I ran the drill 16 times. On the 12th run, she reached across me. Her hand came over the center console and settled at the top of the wheel above mine. Her fingers were cool from the interior air. She said, "You are cutting the correction 1 degree short. Let me show you." She moved the wheel 3 inches with her hand still touching mine. She said, "That is the position I need at the moment you feel the yaw. Feel it now." Her hand was on top of mine. She held it there for a beat longer than she needed to. I did not, at any point, look at her. She released the wheel. She said, "Again." I ran the drill 4 more times. I hit the position every time. She did not correct me again. At the end of the 16th run, she said, "Bring it in." We debriefed the pad footage over coffee in the classroom. She did not sit close to me. She sat in her usual chair at the head of the table, and she reviewed the 16 runs with the same clinical patience she brought to everything, and she did not, at any point in the debrief, reference the moment on the 12th run when her hand had been on top of mine at the top of the wheel. I gave her the jacket back at 3:30. She said, "Keep it for the week. It will rain again on Wednesday." I said, "Understood." I wore the jacket home. I hung it on the back of my closet door and it stayed there for 4 days, and I did not, in any of those 4 days, sit in any room in my apartment that was more than 8 feet from the closet, and when I closed my eyes at night, I could smell the cedar in the fabric across the room. I understood, that Friday night, that whatever was happening with Halden Verland was not just happening on my side. I did not have proof. I had only 3 weeks of observation, and 1 adjusted mirror, and 1 hand on my hand at 10 and 2, and 1 jaw flex in a windshield reflection, and 1 moment in the gravel lot when she had almost given a compliment and then taken it back, inside the same breath. I had no proof. I had, however, catalogued her long enough to know what her tells looked like when they came, and I trusted my own attention. Halden Verland was not attracted to my driving. She was attracted to me, and she was, in the specific way of a woman who ran a small business and depended on her professional reputation for the certification she granted, absolutely never going to say so. The 4th week began on a Monday. That was the Monday she moved me to solo route driving on the rural road that ran east from the academy. It was a good road for training. It had long stretches of clear visibility, moderate elevation changes, 3 intersections and 2 blind curves, and a 2-mile section without any driveways at all. It was the road on which she did her most careful highway transition work, because it was quiet enough to allow real speed and demanding enough to require it be handled correctly. We started at 7:40 on Monday morning. Halden in the passenger seat, coffee in the cup holder for both of us. The Mercedes, still smelling faintly of the previous week's rain because it had sat outside during a storm on Friday night, and the interior had not yet dried out of the particular smell that a warm interior gets after a wet night. She said, "Take the route east. Do not exceed the posted limit. I will call adjustments as we go. Watch your mirrors on a 2-second cycle. Watch the road on everything else." I said, "Understood." She said, "Go." I went. The morning was cool. The road was clear. There were no other cars for the first 6 miles. I moved through the low gears, kept my speed at 50 in the 50 zone, and watched my mirrors on the 2-second cycle Halden had taught me from the first day. Rear view, driver side, road, 2 seconds. Rear view, driver side, road, 2 seconds. She did not say anything for the first 6 miles. She was watching the road ahead. I could see, in my peripheral vision, the way she held her coffee mug in her right hand and her left hand rested lightly on her thigh, the way she was studying the horizon, the way a person studies a chessboard. At mile 7, the road curved slightly to the north and the sun came into the driver's side window at an angle that made the interior brighter. I glanced at the rearview mirror. Her eyes were there. She was not looking at the road ahead. She was looking, past my shoulder, at me. She had been watching me in the mirror. I did not know for how long. I did not know why. Her face was, in the moment I registered her eyes, entirely composed. Nothing in her expression said anything. She was simply looking at me in the mirror while I drove. in exactly the way an instructor might look at a student to evaluate their focus and their posture and the specific way they held their head while they navigated a curve. I understood, in the second before I did anything, that she had been looking at me for longer than that. I smiled. I did not decide to smile. My mouth moved before I had constructed a reason to move it. Small, private, involuntary. The kind of smile that happens when you catch someone looking at you and you are, in the specific unguarded moment of that catch, simply happy about it. I did not turn my head. I did not break my attention on the road. I looked at her eyes in the mirror, and I smiled and I understood, in the fraction of a second between the smile and what came next, that she had not been prepared to be caught. Her foot slammed the passenger brake. The Mercedes came to a hard, controlled stop in the middle of the empty rural road. I registered every physical detail of the deceleration with the clarity of someone whose adrenaline had spiked without any actual emergency to feed it. The seatbelt caught across my shoulder. My coffee slid forward in the cup holder. The dash cam recorded. I understood distantly. The entire braking event. The car stopped. I put it in park because that was the trained response. I looked at Halden. She was not looking at me anymore. She was looking straight ahead through the windshield at the empty stretch of road in front of us. Her jaw was doing the smallest possible tightening at the corner near the ear. Her hand had left the coffee mug and had come to rest on the console between us, and I could see, without any need to lean closer, that the tendons in her forearm were more prominent than they had been 30 seconds ago. She said, "Check your mirror discipline." I said, "My mirror discipline is fine." She said, "You held the mirror for 1.5 seconds. The target is under a second." I said, "I know." She said, "Do it again. Continue east." I put the car in drive. We continued east. We did not speak for the next 4 miles. At mile 11, she called a right turn. I made the right turn. At mile 14, she called a return route. I made the return route. We drove back to the academy in the same silence, and the silence was not, at any point, empty. It was full of the specific texture of 2 women who had both understood exactly what had happened at mile 7 and had both decided, without any need to negotiate the decision, that neither of them was going to acknowledge the understanding out loud. We pulled into the gravel lot at 9:35. Halden got out of the passenger seat. She closed the door behind her. She walked to the bungalow without waiting for me, and she went inside. I sat in the driver's seat of the Mercedes for 1 full minute, with my hands still on the wheel at 10:02. Then I got out and I followed her inside. She was at her desk when I came in. She was reviewing something on her laptop. She did not look up. She said, "The debrief will be at 11. Take your coffee and go through your own tape first. Mark the moments you think we should discuss." I said, "Understood." I took my coffee. I went to the small side room where the review station was set up. I put the file on the monitor and I ran the dashcam footage from the drive. I watched myself pull out of the gravel lot. I watched myself take the road east. I watched my hands at 10:02 and my mirror discipline on the 2-second cycle. I got to mile 7. I watched my glance at the rearview mirror. I watched my smile. I watched, in the corner of the frame where the rear-facing camera caught Halden's profile, her turn her head 1/2 of a second before I glanced at the mirror. She had been looking at me for longer than my glance. She had turned to see me directly. I watched her look at me for 1.6 seconds. I watched me smile. I watched her foot slam the brake. I ran it back 4 times. I did not mark anything for the debrief. At 11 o'clock, we sat at the review station together. Halden pulled up the same footage I had already watched 4 times. She ran it from mile 6. She paused at mile 7. She said, "Explain your line here." I said, "My line was straight. The road was straight." She said, "You held the mirror for 1.5 seconds." I said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" I looked at her. She was not looking at me. She was looking at the monitor. Her hand was on the mouse. Her right wrist showed the watch. Her jaw was, still, doing the very small tightening at the corner near the ear. I said, "I lost focus for 1/2 a second. I have adjusted. It will not happen again." She said, "Good." She closed the footage. She said, "We will do the same drill tomorrow, same road, same conditions." If your mirror discipline is under a second, we move to the interstate work on Wednesday. Understood. I said. Understood. She said. You can go early today. We are done at 3. It was 11:10. She was telling me I could go home 4 hours before the day officially ended. I said, understood. I did not go home. I sat in my car in the gravel lot for 20 minutes. I did not turn on the engine. I looked at the low bungalow through the windshield. I looked at the black Mercedes with the small silver logo. I looked at my hands on the wheel at 10 and 2, which was how I had left them, and I understood that I had, in the last 3 hours, learned something about Halden Verland that I could not now unlearn, and that she had, in the last 3 hours, learned something about me that she had spent 5 weeks trying not to learn. I drove home. I did not tell my roommate about my day. On Tuesday morning, I was at the academy at 7:28. I was in the classroom by 7:30. Halden was already there, at the whiteboard, coffee in the mug with the chipped rim. She looked up when I came in. She said, "Good morning." I said, "Good morning." We ran the same drill. My mirror discipline was under a second. We moved to the interstate work on Wednesday. By the end of the 4th week, I was performing every drill at the level she had trained me to, and she was, in every context, exactly as she had been in the first week: corrective, precise, professionally impersonal. She did not look at me in the rearview mirror. I did not smile. We had, without discussing it, entered a new phase of the certification, defined by both of us pretending very carefully that the mile 7 break had never happened. I understood that this was not sustainable. It stopped being enough on the following Monday. That morning brought a woman I had never seen before to the academy. I got there at 7:28, as I had every morning for the last 4 weeks. The gravel lot had, in addition to Peter's silver hatchback and my own car and Halden's dark green pickup truck, a 4th vehicle. A black SUV with tinted windows and a rental sticker on the rear bumper. The driver's side door was open. A woman was leaning against the door with a coffee in her hand, talking to someone I could not see on the porch of the bungalow. The woman was in her mid-30s. She was tall. She was dressed in dark jeans and a dark tailored jacket and boots that had, unlike Halden's, seen very recent polishing. Her hair was cropped short. She had a professional watchfulness about her that I recognized without needing to have it explained. She was, I understood before I got out of my car, some version of what I was training to become. I got out of my car. She looked over. She smiled. She said, "You must be Mira." I said, "I am. Have we met?" She said, "No." Halden mentioned there was a new student in the cohort. "I'm Cade. Cade Osland. I did the certification 3 years ago. I'm out this way for a client meeting, and Halden lets me drop by for a refresher when I'm in the area." I said, "It is nice to meet you." She said, "You too." She looked at me with the specific attention of a person who had spent 3 years reading small signals for a living. I could not tell what she was reading. I could tell she was reading it. Halden appeared on the porch of the bungalow. She looked at Cade. Then she looked at me. Then she looked back at Cade. Cade said, "Halden." I was just introducing myself. Halden said, "Come inside for coffee. Both of you." Inside, the classroom was warmer than the parking lot. Cade took her coffee from the counter and sat in the chair Peter usually occupied. Peter was not in yet. Cade looked at ease in the classroom in the specific way of a person who had spent enough hours in the room to feel like it was partially hers. She said, "Halden, I told my client I would be 40 minutes. Halden said, "Then we will not waste them. Tell me about the detail." Cade told her about the detail. It was, apparently, a private sector protective driver assignment for a family in Chicago that Cade had held for 18 months. She was in this region for a client meeting that had run long. She wanted, she said, a fresh pair of eyes on her lane change decision-making because her principal had recently added an evening travel pattern that put Cade on unfamiliar rural roads at dusk, and she was not, she said with the same dry precision I had come to associate with Halden, entirely happy with her own reflexes on the second lane change on a specific rural road. Halden said, "We will drive at 9, you and I. Bring your own vehicle." Cade said, "Understood." Then Cade turned to me and she said, So. 4th week. I said, 5th, actually. She said, 5th. So you are the reason Halden has been particular about the current cohort. Something in the room did the very small thing that rooms do when someone has said an accurate thing that no one was supposed to say out loud. Halden did not react. I said, I do not know what that means. Cade smiled at me. Not unkindly, she said. She has been picking her cohorts more selectively the last 2 years. The students in the last 3 cycles have all been, in one way or another, very high performing. She used to take everyone. Now she takes people she thinks she can move to a specific level. I assume you got in on some version of that principle. I said. I did not know that, Cade said. No reason you would. She looked at Halden. Halden was, I saw, not looking at either of us. She was standing at the whiteboard with her hands behind her back and her attention on the wall. Cade said, Halden. She is doing well. Halden said, she is doing what is expected. Cade said, do not do that. Not with me. For the first time in 5 weeks I saw the composure crack visibly. It cracked in the smallest possible way. It cracked in the corner of Halden's mouth. It cracked for a fraction of a second before she caught it and put it back. Cade saw it. Cade had seen it before I had. Cade stood up. She said, I am going to go run the SUV. Halden, come out when you are ready. Mira, it was very nice to meet you. Take care of yourself. She looked at me for a beat too long. She said the last sentence with a warmth I would remember later. Then she left. Halden and I were alone in the classroom. Halden said, Peter will be in at 7:40. We will start with the classroom module on evasive lane changes. Cade will be back at 10. She will observe the second half of your drill. Understood. I said. Understood. She said, do not read into anything, Cade said. I said, understood. She looked at me. It was the first time in 5 weeks I had seen her look at me at the beginning of a day with anything other than professional evaluation. Her face was tired. Her jaw was doing the very small thing. Her hand, resting on the whiteboard tray, tightened around the marker she had just picked up. She said, Mira. I said, yes. She said, Peter will be here shortly. I said, I know. She said, we will get through today. I said, I know that too. The morning ran as it had run every morning. The evasive lane change module in the classroom went well. Peter, who had arrived at 7:42 and been reprimanded for it, performed cleanly on the closed track. Cade returned at 10, as promised. She rode along in the back seat while I ran the interstate evasive maneuvers Halden had scheduled. Cade said nothing during the drive. In the debrief afterward, she offered 2 observations that were both correct and gently delivered. She said, you have very good hands. I said, thank you. She said, you have the specific kind of good hands that Halden was best at developing when she was still doing this every day. It is not luck. You have been taught well. She looked at Halden. Halden was looking at the debrief monitor. Cade said, I have to go. I have a 2:30 in the city. Halden said, drive safe. Cade said, you too. She said it, understood, to both of us. She left. At the door she turned. She looked at Halden, then at me, then back at Halden. She said, Halden, get her certified. She is ready. Then she was gone. The rest of the day passed without incident. In the afternoon we did 2 hours of urban route work on the loop through the rural town. In the debrief, Halden reviewed my footage with the same clinical precision she had used from the first day. She marked 1 line correction and 1 following distance correction, and she released me at 3:30. I did not go home. I sat in my car in the gravel lot until Peter had left. I watched Peter drive away. I sat in my car until 4 o'clock. Then I got out of my car and I walked back into the bungalow. Halden was at her desk. Her laptop was open. She looked up. She said, you are supposed to be gone. I said, I know. She said, then why are you here? I said, I have a question I would like you to answer. She sat back from the laptop. She folded her hands on the desk in front of her. She had done this exact motion, I would think about later, exactly 7 times in the last 5 weeks, and each of the 7 times had been the moment before she gave me the most useful correction of the session. She was making the same physical preparation to answer a question that I was about to ask. I said, Cade knows what happened at mile 7 2 weeks ago. Halden said, Cade knows nothing about what happened at mile 7 2 weeks ago. I said, Cade knows without needing to know the specifics. Halden was quiet for a beat. She said, Yes. I said, Because it is on your face and she has known you for 4 years and she can see what is on your face. Halden said, Yes. I said, Halden, I need you to say the true version of what happened at mile 7. She looked at me for a long time. Her face was composed. Her hands were folded. The chronograph on her right wrist caught the afternoon light coming through the small window behind her desk. She said, I hit the brake because you smiled at me in the mirror, and the smile was not something I had prepared to receive, and I reacted to it in the only way I could that would end the moment before I did something less professional. The bungalow was very quiet. I said, Thank you. She said, Do not thank me. That was not a favor to you. I said, I know. I am still thanking you. She said, Mira. I said, Yes. She said, I cannot say anything else. Not now. Not in this room. Not before the certification is complete. I said, I know. She said, 1 more week. Then we will have a different conversation. I said, Understood. She looked at me across the desk. Her face was, for the first time in 5 weeks, not composed. It was tired and honest and, I understood, a little afraid. She said, Please go home now. I got up. I went to the door. I stopped with my hand on the frame. I said, Halden. She said, Yes. I said, You have been the best instructor I have ever had. Whatever the other conversation is, that part is already true. She did not respond. Her jaw did the very small thing. I left. I got in my car. I did not put the key in the ignition. I sat in the driver's seat with my hands at 10 and 2 on a wheel that was not moving, in a car that was not running, in a gravel lot outside a bungalow where Halden Verland was. I understood without needing to look, standing at the window watching me sit in my car. I sat there for 11 minutes. Then I put the key in the ignition. I started the car. I put it in drive. I drove home. I did not tell my roommate about my day. The next morning, I was at the academy at 7:28. I had slept in 3-hour intervals. I had woken twice at the specific hour I had left the gravel lot, and I had gone back to sleep the second time because my body was disciplined about it in a way my mind was not. I had made coffee at 6:15. I had put on the shirt I always wore on Tuesdays. I had left the apartment at 7:10, and I had driven the 40 minutes to Verland Precision with my hands at 10 and 2 and my mirror discipline on the 2-second cycle, and I had felt, the whole drive, as if I were carrying a piece of glass in my chest that I did not want to jostle. Halden was at the whiteboard when I came in. Coffee in the chipped mug, sleeves rolled to the elbow, watch on the right wrist. Her face was exactly as composed as it had been at 7:30 on Monday of the first week, which meant, I understood, that she had done the same 3-hour interval work I had done, and had arrived at the same conclusion I had arrived at, which was that the only way through the final week was to run it exactly the way we had run every week that came before it. She said, Good morning. I said, Good morning. Peter came in at 7:32, 1 minute early. He said hello. He took his coffee. He sat in his chair. The day ran. Tuesday's drill on the rural road east was clean. My mirror discipline held under a second. Halden called adjustments without inflection. My line at mile 7 was the same line I had run every day since Monday of the first week, and I did not, at any point on the drive, glance at the rearview mirror for longer than the exercise required. Halden did not look at me. She looked at the road ahead and she looked at her side mirror on the 2-second cycle she had trained me on. We drove east. We turned. We drove west. We parked in the gravel lot at 9:32. She said, Good. I said, Thank you. She said, Understood. Wednesday was rain. The pad. She did not offer me a jacket this time because I had checked the forecast and had brought my own. We ran the wet skid drill. I hit the position at the top of the wheel on every single run. She did not need to reach across the console. On the debrief, she offered one correction, on a moment when my throttle had come in half a beat late, and the correction was accurate and impersonal. And I said, understood, and we moved on. Thursday was interstate. 2 hours at speed. I ran evasive lane changes and highway transition drills on the 60-mile stretch of I-91 that Halden used for advanced work. Peter was in the back seat as an observer. Halden narrated the drills for Peter's benefit. Her voice did not do the thing it had done. Once, on the 12th run of the wet pad drill, her hand did not leave the console. Friday was debrief only. Full week review. Halden ran the footage from every drill of the week on the classroom monitor, and she assessed both of us with the same clinical patience she had used on the first day. When she was done, she looked up at the two of us and she said, "You have both progressed as expected. The certification assessment begins on Monday. Written on Monday. Closed track on Tuesday. Full road on Wednesday. Debrief and signing on Wednesday afternoon. Be here at 7:30 every morning and be ready to be evaluated at your ceiling." Peter said, "Understood." I said, "Understood." She said, "Have a good weekend." I drove home that Friday afternoon and I thought about the phrase, "have a good weekend," which was the most conversational thing Halden had said to me in 6 weeks, and which she had delivered in exactly the same tone she used for everything else, and which I understood to be, in Halden Verland's specific vocabulary, the sound of a woman who had made it through the week she had promised herself she would make it through, and who was, for the first time in 7 weeks of managing this thing, allowing herself a small sound of exhale. I had 2 days. I did not fill them with anything. I did the laundry. I read a book I could not, 20 minutes later, have summarized for anyone. On Sunday night I sat by the window and thought about the fact that in 3 days Halden Verland was going to sign a piece of paper and I was going to leave the academy for the last time as her student. Monday's written assessment lasted 2.5 hours. 120 questions covering vehicle dynamics, defensive scenarios, threat assessment, legal parameters, and situational judgment. I answered every question I knew and I marked "I do not know" on the 4 I did not. I passed with 114 correct. Peter passed with 116. Tuesday was closed, track, the full suite, emergency lane change at 50, threshold braking from 60, panic stop from 70, skid recovery on the wet pad, high-speed evasive, drill through a course of cones. I ran the suite in the specific state of quiet focus I had learned to enter when the stakes were highest. At the end of the 4 hours I got out of the training, Mercedes and I looked at Halden across the roof and she said, "Good." That was the whole assessment. Wednesday morning was the full road assessment. 90 miles. Rural, suburban, urban, interstate. Halden in the passenger seat. 2 dashcam angles. Every rule I had learned in 6 weeks tested inside a single continuous drive. Peter had gone in the morning and had passed. I went at 10. We drove until 1. We came back to the academy at 1:15. Halden did not, at any point in the drive, look at me in the rearview mirror. I did not, at any point in the drive, smile. At 2 o'clock we sat in the classroom together. Peter had left for lunch. It was just the two of us. Halden pulled up the certification file on her laptop and reviewed the whole cycle with me. Written score. Closed track. Full road. Instructor's remarks. Skill categories. She said, "In every category you have performed at a level that would place you in the top quartile of every cohort I have certified in 7 years. You have, in 6 weeks, become the kind of driver I want on the road when I am on the road. That is my assessment. I am signing." She signed. She turned the sheet around. She slid it across the desk. She said, "Sign here, and here, and here." I signed. "And there, and there." She said, "You are certified. The certificate will be mailed to you in 5 business days. Your file will be sent to the state certifying board this week. Attorney Trentham will receive her insurance documentation from the board on the following Monday." I said, "Thank you." She said, "You are welcome." The certification was official. I was no longer her student. She looked at me across the desk. She said, "Mira." I said, "Yes." She said, "Would you stay for a conversation?" I said, "Yes." She got up. She closed the classroom door. She sat back down at the desk. She folded her hands on top of the folded certification file. She looked at me with the composed patience of a woman who had spent the last 2 weeks preparing the sentences she was about to say, and who was going to deliver them without softening. She said, "I am going to file a disclosure with the state certifying board tomorrow morning. I am going to describe, accurately, the nature of the conflict of interest that developed during your certification cycle. I am going to describe the specific incident at mile 7. I am going to describe the fact that I concealed the conflict from the board and from you and from Peter for 2 weeks after the incident. I am going to describe the conversation we had in this bungalow 1 week ago, which is the reason the concealment ended. I am going to disclose that the certification you have just earned was earned on merit and predates the disclosure, but I am going to make the disclosure regardless." "Do you understand?" I said. "Yes," she said. "The board will convene a review. The review will take approximately 60 days. During the review, Verland Precision will suspend intake of new students. I will retain my certifying authority provisionally during the review. The board will assess whether my judgment during your cycle was compromised in a way that affected the certification, and whether my judgment during previous cycles has been affected in ways I have not disclosed. I have already prepared a summary of the previous 7 years of certifications for the board. There is no other cycle in which the specific conflict developed. Do you understand?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Peter has been advised that a disclosure is being filed. He has been given the option to be listed as a cohort member in the disclosure. He has consented. He is not implicated. His certification is unaffected. He has been informed that the disclosure concerns you and me, and does not involve him except as a cohort observer." I said, "Understood." She said, "The review outcome may include a formal advisement or a requirement that future cycles include a co-signing instructor. I have already begun the process of retaining one. Rhea Whitlock. She was at the Georgia Academy for 11 years. She is available," I said. "You are being extraordinarily thorough." She said, "Yes, I am." She looked at me. Her hands were still folded on the folder. Her face was composed. She was, I understood, telling me the things she needed to tell me in the register she used for the things she needed to be able to say, without her voice doing anything her voice was not prepared to do. She said, "I want to make one thing very clear before we go any further." I said, "Yes." She said, "The disclosure is not conditional on you. I am not filing the disclosure because you asked me to file the disclosure. I am not filing the disclosure to earn the right to have a different conversation with you. I am filing the disclosure because it is the correct professional action, and I should have taken it 3 weeks ago, and I have not, and I am now." I said, "I know." She said, "I am telling you this because I do not want you to feel that any future conversation between us has been made conditional on your response to my accountability. My accountability is mine. Yours is yours. They are separate." I said, "I know that too." She said, "Do you understand what I am not saying?" I said, "You are not asking me to wait for you." She said, "That is correct." I said, "I know. I have already decided to wait for you." Her face did something, not a smile, not the small crack at the mouth I had seen once when Kate had pushed her, something quieter, something that was, I understood in the second before she caught it and returned to composure, the closest thing to relief I had seen on Halden Verland's face in 6 weeks of watching her closely. She said, "Please do not decide anything on the basis of what I am doing this week." I said, "I am not deciding on the basis of what you are doing this week. I am deciding on the basis of 6 weeks of watching you decide." She looked at me for a long time. The bungalow was very quiet. She said, "Mira." I said, "Yes." She said, "You should go home now." I said, "Yes." I got up. I picked up the copy of the certification she had given me. I put it in my folder. I walked to the door. I stopped with my hand on the frame. I said, "Halden." She said, "Yes." I said, "When the review is over, and only when the review is over, and only on your timeline, you know where to find me." She said, "I do." I left. I drove home. This time I did not sit in the car. I went upstairs. I closed the door of my apartment. I sat on the floor of the hallway with my back against the wall and my folder on my knees, and I looked at the small silver stamp on the corner of the certification, which said Halden Verland, Chief Instructor, and I let the piece of glass I had been carrying in my chest all week set itself down carefully on the tile beside me. Then I got up. I made dinner. I called my sister. I did not tell her about my day, exactly, but I told her enough that she understood something had ended and something else had not yet begun. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You sound like yourself for the first time in 2 months." I said, "Yes." She said, "That is a good sign." The disclosure was filed on Thursday morning at 9:15. I know because Halden sent me one email at 9:18 with 2 lines. Filed at 9:15, no further contact from me during the review process. That was it. She did not sign the email. She did not need to. I responded at 9:20. Understood. Take care of yourself. That was the only communication for the next 62 days. The Monday after certification, I began driving attorney Trentham. The Mercedes handled well. I picked her up at 7:15 every morning. I drove her to court or to the office. I drove her to the airport when she had client meetings out of state. I drove her home at whatever hour her day ended, which was sometimes 7 and sometimes 11, and once, in the second week, 1 in the morning after a mediation that had run past everyone's endurance. I did what I had been trained to do. I did not exceed the posted limit. I watched my mirrors on a 2-second cycle. I held my hands at 10 and 2. Attorney Trentham was, in the first week, mildly startled by how much better a driver I was than she had expected. In the second week, she stopped commenting. In the third week, she began having conversations on the phone in the back seat as if I were not there, which was, I understood, the highest professional compliment she was capable of giving. My driving had become the thing she no longer had to think about. I thought about the drive constantly. Every route was a series of decisions I had learned from Halden. Every hand position was one Halden had put my hand into. Every mirror check was on the 2-second cycle. I had been trained to be a specific kind of driver by a specific woman for 6 weeks. And now I was that driver. And she was 2 counties away in a bungalow that had suspended intake. And she was not going to email me again until a review board she had voluntarily invited to review her had returned its findings. I did not call her. I did not drive out to the academy. I did not, in the 62 days, do a single thing that would have compromised the discipline of what she was doing. Twice I dreamed about the wet skid pad. Once I dreamed about mile 7. Once I dreamed about her jacket, which was still hanging on the back of my closet door. At day 31, Cade Osland sent me a text. She had submitted an unsolicited character letter to the certifying board on Halden's behalf. She said Halden's disclosure was, in her judgment, an act of professional integrity, of a kind she had rarely observed in this industry. She was not asking me to do anything. She just wanted me to know. I wrote back, "Thank you. Take care of yourself." At day 54, the board issued its findings. I learned about them from the public register, which I had been checking every morning of the 15th, because I had not been able to stop myself from setting a calendar reminder, formal advisement, requirement of co-signing instructor for future cohorts where prior contact existed, no suspension of certifying authority. Verland Precision cleared to resume intake at the discretion of the chief instructor. I read the 3 lines twice. I closed the browser. I drove attorney Trentham to court. At the end of the day, I drove attorney Trentham home. I parked the Mercedes in the underground garage of the firm at 8:15 in the evening. I turned off the engine. I sat in the driver's seat for a minute with my hands on the wheel. Then I got out. I locked the car. I walked up the ramp to the street. Halden was sitting on the low concrete wall outside the building. She was in dark jeans and a gray sweater. Her hair was down. Her watch was not on her right wrist. Her boots were the same boots. Her hands were folded loosely in her lap. She was looking at me the way I had, over the last 62 days, catalogued that she must be looking whenever I dreamed her. I stopped walking. She stood up. She said, "I understand if you would rather I had waited." I said, "You did wait." She said, "The review closed 8 days ago." I said, "I know. I saw the register." She said, "I know you did. I checked the register. I saw when you accessed it." I said, "Halden." She said, "Yes." I said. You do not have to explain how long you waited or why you waited. I am glad you are here. She said. Would you talk with me? I said. Yes. I said. Walk with me. We walked. We walked north up the avenue in the specific quiet of a downtown block after 7 in the evening on a weekday, when the office buildings had emptied, and the restaurants had not yet filled, and the sidewalks belonged, for a specific window of the day, to whoever wanted them. She matched her pace to mine. She did not reach for my hand. She did not speak. We walked 8 blocks. At the corner of my street I stopped. I said, I live 1 block that way. She said, I know. I said, you know because, she said, because I looked up your address in the certifying board's registration record when I filed the disclosure. It was the only time I have looked it up. I have not been here before. I said, come upstairs. She said, are you sure? I said, yes. We walked the block. We went into my building. We took the elevator to my floor. I unlocked my door. I let her in. My roommate was not home. She was in Chicago for a wedding for the weekend. The apartment was very quiet. The evening light was coming in through the window at the specific angle it came in at this time of year in this apartment, which was gold and slightly diffused, and made the small room feel warmer than it was. Halden stood in the middle of the room. She did not sit down. She looked around with the same attention she looked at everything. She said, I have things I want to say. I said, I know. She said, I would like to say them in order. I said, yes. She said, first, I was aware of you within the first hour of the first day. I knew what that meant. I decided to manage it inside the professional envelope of the certification. That was the correct decision for the first week. It was not the correct decision by the 4th. I should have brought a co-signing instructor in for you at the beginning of the 4th week. I did not, because I told myself I could manage it, and I could not. I said, yes. She said, second, on the day of mile 7, I hit the brake because I was watching you in a way I had no right to be watching you, and you smiled at me in a way that was fully within your right, and I reacted the only way I knew how, which was to end the moment with a mechanical response. That reaction was not appropriate. It was professionally instrumental to my own control. It was not, in any part, about your driving. I said, I know. She said, third. In the 2 weeks between mile 7 and the day you asked me to say it, I performed my professional obligations correctly, and I did not perform my ethical obligation to disclose. I lied by omission to Peter, to you, and to the certifying board. My discipline in the classroom does not compensate for that. I said, I know. She said, fourth. When you came into the bungalow that Monday afternoon and you asked me to say the true version of what happened, I did not offer the disclosure I should have offered. You asked me for a personal confession. That confession was not enough. The disclosure was owed to the board, not to you. I did not file the disclosure until I had signed your certification, which I now understand was the wrong order. I said, you filed within the week. She said, I filed within the week. I should have filed within the day. I did not, because I wanted to certify you first, because I trusted my own judgment about your certification, which was itself a form of the same problem I was filing about. I said, yes. She said, fifth, I am not asking you for anything. I am telling you what I did. I am asking whether you would like to hear how I plan to do things differently going forward. I said, yes. She said, Verlin Precision resumes intake in 6 weeks. Rhea Whitlock will be a resident co-signing instructor for the next 12 months. Any student whose prior contact with me could raise the specific question that arose during your cycle will be referred, from intake, to Rhea's cycle rather than mine. I have set a rule for myself that any student who I become aware of within the first hour of the first day will be referred to Rhea for the entire cycle. I am the one who sets that rule. I am the one who enforces it. I have written the rule down and shared it with Rhea, and with the certifying board. I said, that is thorough. She said, you are correct, it is thorough, I would like it to be enough. I said, it is enough for the professional part. She said, yes. I said, we are on the personal part now. She said, yes. She looked at me. She had, all through the recitation, kept her face composed and her hands loose at her sides. Now, at the change of register, she did the smallest possible thing. She loosened her shoulders. She turned her hands so the palms faced forward at her sides. She was, in the specific vocabulary of Halden Verland, presenting herself unarmed. She said, "I have been in love with you since sometime in the second week. I do not know exactly when. I do not think it matters exactly when. I want you to know that I have been." The apartment was very quiet. She said, "I am not asking you to say anything back. I am telling you, because you deserve to know. And because I have spent the last 62 days understanding that the reason I could not say it was that I was going to say it in a room where it would not compromise anything and would not owe anyone anything except the truth." I said, "Halden?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Come here." She came. I did not go to her. I did not need to. She walked the 4 steps across the apartment, and she stopped 1 arm's length from me, and she looked at me with her hands still at her sides, palms still forward, face still composed at the very edge of its composure, and she waited. I said, "You have been very careful with me for 7 weeks. You do not need to be careful anymore." I put my hand on her jaw. Warm skin. The very small movement of a woman who had, in 7 weeks, not been touched by the specific person she was permitting to touch her now. Her eyes closed. Her hand came up and settled at my waist and stayed there, and it stayed there in the specific way I had learned to recognize as promise rather than claim, and I kissed her. It was not quick. It was not frantic. It was patient in the specific way she had been patient with me on the wet skid pad, and it was earned in the specific way she had earned it by filing a disclosure that was not conditional on my response, and it was, in the first 3 seconds, the exact answer to a question I had been asking since the 12th run on a Monday in the rain. She made a small sound, not a word. Just the small sound that a person makes when they have been holding something for a long time and are, finally, allowed to release it. I moved my hand from her jaw to the back of her neck. Her hair was down. It was softer than I had expected. She had, all 6 weeks, worn it pulled back, and I had never touched it, and now it was under my fingers and it was mine to touch, and I let my hand rest there for a long moment and I kissed her again. The second kiss was different. It was slower. It was the kiss of a woman who understood, now, that she had time. Her hand at my waist tightened once. Her mouth opened under mine. I felt the small, warm weight of her body against mine, and I understood, in that specific second, that Halden Verland had been holding herself at a distance from me for 7 weeks, not because she did not want to be close to me, but because she had known exactly how close she was going to want to be once she started, and she had been trying to save both of us from the specific cost of finding out. She stepped closer. Her forehead rested against mine. Neither of us moved for a long moment. She said, "Mira." I said, "Yes." She said, "I love you." I said, "I love you back." She said, "I would like this to be a life." I said, "I would too." She said, "Then we will do it correctly." I said, "We will." We stayed in the gold evening light for a long time, and neither of us needed to say anything else. Halden had made it clear, in the register of every ordered sentence of her apology, that she wanted the first evening of this life to be, above all things, unambiguous. So we stood in my living room, and we talked. About Ria. About the academy. About the small house I had begun looking at outside the city, because the commute would work better once winter came. She listened the way she listened in the classroom. She answered the way she answered on the pad. When she left at 11, she paused at the door, and she looked at me for a beat with her hand still on the doorframe. She said, "I would like to call you tomorrow morning." I said, "Yes." She said, "I have a transition meeting with Ria at 10. If you would like to come, I would like you to be there." I said, "I will drive you." She said, "You will drive me." I said, "Yes." She left. I closed the door. I stood in the middle of my living room, with the gold shone almost gone, and I understood that whatever had begun in the bungalow at mile 7 had, tonight, become the thing it was going to be, and that the thing it was going to be was patient and honest, and mine. I slept for the first full night in 9 weeks. She called at 7. Her voice on the phone was different than it had been in the classroom. Quieter. Not warmer, exactly. Less armored. She said, "Good morning." I said, "Good morning," she said. I said, "You said good morning. That was correct." She said, "That is true. I forgot for a second what I was allowed to know how to do." I said, "You are allowed." I picked her up at 9. She sat in the passenger seat of the Mercedes with her coffee in the cup holder and her left hand resting on the console, and once, at a stoplight, she reached over and put her hand on mine at 10 and 2, and she left it there for the length of the light. At the academy, Rhea Whitlock was already in the gravel lot. She was in her late 40s, sturdy, gray-haired, the specific composed presence of a woman who had been teaching people to drive since before I was born. Halden introduced us. Rhea shook my hand. She looked at Halden. She said, "Halden, you have chosen well." Halden said, "I did not choose." Rhea said, "Yes, that is what I meant." The transition meeting took 2 hours. At the end of it, Rhea looked at me and she said, "Take her to lunch. She has been working since 5. I said, "I will." I did. The following 6 months settled into a shape neither of us had exactly predicted. Halden ran her academy with Rhea as resident co-signing instructor. The intake cycle in October ran with a full cohort of 4 students, all referred to Rhea, because Rhea did not have any prior relationship with any of them, and Halden preferred not to have new prior contact questions raised in the first cycle after the review. Halden taught the classroom modules and the closed-track drills. Rhea signed the certifications. The system worked. In November, Halden published the operational rules on the Academy's website, unprompted, because she wanted the transparency to be public. 3 former students wrote to her to say they respected the decision. Cade Osland wrote to say she wished more instructors in the industry did the same. I continued to drive attorney Trentham. In November, she gave me a raise and a new title, Director of Executive Services. She said the title was inaccurate and she did not care. She said what she cared about was that I was going to be around for the next 10 years, and she wanted me to have a title that reflected it. I said thank you. I did not tell her that the reason I could commit to the next 10 years was that I had found the specific person I wanted to build them around, and that the specific person was not going to be anywhere I was not. In December, I moved. I gave up the shared apartment in the city, and I took a small house 40 minutes outside the city, halfway between the firm and the academy. The commute worked. My roommate, when I told her, was not surprised. She said she had understood for months. She helped me pack. She and I stayed friends. Halden helped me carry boxes on a Saturday in the second week of December, and she made coffee in the small kitchen, and she looked around the small living room and she said, "This is a good house." I said, "Yes." She said, "You picked it for the commute." I said, "I picked it for us." She said, "I know. That is what I meant." She started keeping a small bag at the house. In February, she started keeping her boots by the door. In April, she started keeping a black polo hanging in the closet next to my work clothes. In June, we stopped tracking whose things were where. The following spring, Cade Osland flew out for a weekend. We took her to dinner at a small place in the rural town near the academy. Cade looked at Halden across the table with the specific attention of a person who had spent 4 years reading small signals for a living. She said, "You look better than you have in years." Halden said, "I know." Cade said, "Take care of that." Halden said, "I am." Cade looked at me. She said, "You too." I said, "I am." That fall, in the second year, we married. It was a small event at a rural farmhouse with 16 people. Attorney Trentham was there. Judge Mara was there because Attorney Trentham insisted, and because Judge Mara had, we had learned, sent Halden a private letter of support during the review process that Halden had never mentioned to me until Judge Mara insisted on toasting it at the reception. Cade Osland was there. Peter sent a card and a small silver keychain from Portland with a note that said, "Thank you for the 6 weeks. It was an honor to sit in the classroom while you two figured it out." Rhea Whitlock officiated because she was ordained, and because Halden had asked her, and because Rhea had said, when Halden asked, that it was the first time in her career someone had asked her to officiate their wedding, and that she found it a very reasonable request from a woman who had spent the first 3 months of their acquaintance signing certifications on the woman's behalf. Halden wore a dark suit. I wore a cream-colored dress. She said her vows without looking at her notes. She said, "Mira, 7 years ago, I opened an academy because I wanted a place where I could hold myself to the standard I had held other people to for a long time. I did not know when I opened it that the standard was going to become you. I love you the way I love the work, completely, without editorializing, and with the specific attention of a person who does not want to miss a single detail." I said mine back. They were shorter. I said, "Halden, you spent 7 weeks not letting me see your hair down. I have spent the last 2 years watching you sleep with it spread across the pillow. Every morning that has happened has felt like a promise being kept. I promise the same. Every morning." She smiled. It was small. It was contained. It was, by then, familiar. We drove home from the farmhouse in the same Mercedes I had been driving for Attorney Trentham. I drove. She sat in the passenger seat with her hand on the console. The road was empty. It was late. The rural stars were, in that specific stretch of the drive, as clear as they got. She said, "Do you want me to take a shift?" I said, "No. I want you to look at me in the mirror." She said, "All right." She looked at me in the mirror. I smiled. She smiled back. Neither of us hit the brake. We drove home. 15 years later, on a Sunday afternoon in June, I was driving with Halden in the passenger seat of my own car. Not the Mercedes. I had bought the car myself when I left the firm 3 years earlier to open a small consultancy, training executive assistants and household drivers in defensive driving fundamentals. Halden was still at Verland Precision, which she now ran with Ria as full partner and 2 younger co-instructors. She was 56. She had gone completely gray in the 2 years after the wedding and had never once done anything about it, and she wore her hair short now, and the gray suited her the way silver suits certain metals. We were driving through the rural roads near the academy on a route I had known for 15 years. The windows were down. The afternoon was warm. At a stoplight, I caught her eyes in the rearview mirror. She was looking at me. I smiled. She smiled back. Small, contained, full. The light turned green. Neither of us hit the brake. I drove us home to the house we had built together, the one with the 2 coffee mugs on the kitchen counter and the shell jacket that was now soft with age and hung in the mudroom for whichever of us needed it in the rain. Halden's hand rested on the console. I kept mine at 10 and 2. Some things she had taught me had never gone away. She had also never gone away.